Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Environmental Impact Assessments, and in today's lecture we are going to cover EIA methods, and we'll look into how we undertake EIA for when we do landscape and visual assessment. So we have seen this before, but when we talk about landscape, it's considered to be an important for quality of life for all the people in different contexts. So you can see what the European Landscape Convention talks about this. So if you look at the function of a landscape, like why it's important, then landscape provides a setting for us to undertake day-to-day activities of our life, and then it allows us to undertake activities to support our livelihoods, and then we also connect with the place. We have a sense of place, we have a sense of belongingness to a place, and then we also enjoy and the vital elements of the flora and fauna, and then we also have like the cultural connection with the place. We have historic connection with the place. There are all sorts of our association with the place in terms of what we have done in that place. Our memories are related with the place, and then we also have the these landscape provides us opportunity for recreational and then to enjoy the beauty of that place, and then we also see health benefits. So there are a lot of benefits, services which come from the landscape, and then it becomes an important part while we deal with EIA. So whenever the project comes, they are likely to impact the landscape. So there's a term, landscape effect. So landscape effect means there's a change in landscape. There's the change which happens in the landscape, and it changes the character, the quality which it has, and it's assessed as an effect on the environmental resources. So we evaluate that, what kind of change has happened, what kind of change in terms of quality has happened, what change in terms of character has happened, and then what it has effect on other resources, environmental resources, because of that kind of change in that landscape. So that is termed as landscape effect. Then if you look at landscape, what does that include? So landscape, it can have rural areas, landscape can be in the urban areas also. So you must have seen townscapes of various cities, how the townscapes are. Then you can also have marine landscape like seascapes. So there can be a range of landscape. Then there's another term which is visual effects. So visual effects is like what kind of change you see in the appearance, how things appear in front of you because of the kind of change which is happening. So that's the visual effects. And this is also looked through the perspective of what kind of change has happened, and what kind of change that has happened in the visual eventually impacts us, the people. So we had, for this particular components, we have already seen the legislative, the legal aspect of it. So for this particular session, our coverage will include that we'll look at the concepts involved in this, a few more concepts we're going to look at, and then we'll look at various like what is really done at the scoping and baseline study stage pertaining to landscape and visual assessment. And then what do you undertake in impact prediction and evaluation? How do you assess the landscape effects? How do you assess the visual effects? And how do you indicate that? How do you present your results? Or how do you really present your perspective of what kind of change you're seeing? And then how do you undertake cumulative assessments? And then how do you also see how the effect might change in terms of daylight, sunlight, and things like that? So, accordingly, the learning outcomes, the expected learning outcome is that you should be able to define concepts after completion of the session. You should be able to identify items to be covered in scoping and baseline study. And then you should be able to identify impacts and methods used for the purpose of assessing landscape effects, visual effects, and then all the methods used for showing all these kind of effects. So moving on to the concept part, the first part. So how do we really define landscape? So landscape as defined by the European Landscape Convention is the landscape as a zone or area as perceived by local people. So it's by the local people or visitors who come to a place whose visual features and characteristics are the results of the action of natural and the culture which is there. So the human factors, so how we see it, how the local people see, how the visitors see, because of the context, because of whatever is at the back, and what's the story behind it, and how it visually appears. So all that connects or relates to landscape. So if you look at the key aspects to this definition, you will see that if you think of all the places through which you connect, so the landscape changes through time, and then it would all have all kind of forces working, natural forces, as well as how do we interact that place. And you would also see that landscape is composite of all the natural and cultural elements. So looking at the factors that contribute to the landscape, so there is natural factors such as geology, landform, hydrology, and so on. Then you also see the cultural, social factors like what kind of land use is there, what kind of settlement pattern is there, how is the place, is it enclosed, open, how is the ownership, and how much time has gone behind that evolving of that landscape. And then also it depends on the perception and what kind of aesthetic sense we connect with. So how do we perceive that place in terms of what we see, how do we feel about that place, so what sense we get from that particular place, and what kind of memories are there for this place. So landscape evaluation has been done for quite some time for EIA purpose, but then there has been change in terms of how we have approached the subject. So we see that there's like landscape quality. Earlier, we had looked into more of a landscape quality. So, and now, rather than looking at the quality, we have now started understanding the landscape character. So there has been a shift. So it is said that from 1980s, we have moved from preserving like whatever is the best. We have only focused on the best, and then have not really taken care of the other components of it. But from 1980s, we see that rather than good or bad, we have tried to retain the character of its place as it is, and what value it has to the people there. So rather than just focusing on the best part of it. So we see that it involves the process, the landscape evolves through time, and then you also had designated areas. Because of the first approach where you looked at the quality, like where you would only emphasize on the beautiful places, then you had designated areas, and then all the resources would be focused on that. So that would lead to the negligence of the other places. So that approach has changed, and now It has also changed because the taste of people also change. What they consider beautiful at this time may not consider beautiful at the later. So understanding the character, landscape character, had much more value than just looking at the quality or the beauty part of it. So we see that there was a shift from landscape assessments. We really moved on to the landscape assessment from the landscape evaluation part. So when we did the quality, then we did landscape evaluations. If you understand that term, landscape evaluation, where we looked at the landscape quality. Now we look at landscape assessments, where we look at the landscape character. So the difference between this landscape assessment and landscape evaluation is that earlier evaluation, we tried to find out the value, what beauty it has. But then now with the landscape assessments, we try to find out how different they are, how distinct and unique they are in its own terms. So looking at the characteristic of an individual landscape, which is there. So that allows us to take diverse range of landscape, and then what kind of services and benefits we get from that landscape. So earlier we saw it as like a beauty, but then now we saw it as an environment, like complete environment, which is unique in its way, distinct in its way. So if we define landscape character, it's like distinct, recognizable, and consistent pattern of elements in the landscape that makes one landscape different from another rather than better or worse. So what does landscape character comprise of? You see that landscape has elements and characteristics such as you have all these landforms, geology, soil, you have water bodies, catchment, trees, woodland. Then you also have features and patterns of the boundaries, how they are. Then you can have habitat, all kind range of species which are there, what kind of settlements and what kind of patterns they have followed in terms of the development, and then what history is connected with the site, what kind of features are highlighted, and how do you interact that with that place, what kind of experience you have in that. So you see that landscapes are also categorized, and with this new concept, you see that there are 159 landscape character areas in England. You can see that. So you use this landscape character concept for identifying a lot of landscape areas. So the way you capture this is like you look at the complexity, how complex it is. Then you look at the how coherent it is in terms of how they are arranged and how they are distributed, and what kind of relationship you have, stewardship you have with the place. How do you imagine about the place? How do you perceive that place? And at what scale is that? And what kind of naturalness that space brings? And then what kind of history, the story behind is there, and then also how whenever you see it for a short period, what kind of ephemera it creates, and for that particular short period also what kind of experiences it creates for the people there. So on that way, we look at all all criterias which are used for capturing these elements here, landscape elements. You have these resources and approach to landscape character assessments. This is available, and you have also Scandinavian resources also, which also gives you how to identify these landscape characters. So here, through this system, you see that there are 5 types of landscape models which have been created by Stephenson. So this is related with like whether the landscape is static or dynamic, or it has spatial or temporal portrayal. So you see that in this table, you have static means it's very stable, it is as it is, or dynamic, it continuously keeps changing, evolving. So based on that, there are 5 types which have been evolved. So you see the type A, which is like static spatial, so it is distributed around an area. And the emphasis in this is much more on the how it physically appears, the landscape appears. Then you have another type, which is type B, where you have dynamic, and it is also in the space, in the area. So emphasis on the interaction between forms, relationship, and practice at that time. So you also find type C, which is static in nature. You see you look at the historical emphasis, how you connect with this place. And then you have dynamic temporal, where you see that how you interact with that place has values. And then you have another last type, which is type E, which has dynamic spatial temporal emphasis on the interconnection between various forms and how these places relate, and over space from time to time and from space to space, so that you see so how static or dynamic and how these things are there. So that way is also the space has been identified, those categories have been developed, which can be used when you do your EIA here. So in order to capture this, like whether it is static or dynamic, and capturing dynamic can be very difficult. So there are some methods which are there to capture the dynamic component of a landscape. So you can do cultural mapping, where you can like what kind of festivals, what kind of rituals takes place. So that can be mapped. And then you can cultural mapping and ecological system mapping can be done, which can capture all these dynamic spatial approach. And then you can also have historic accounts and mapping. So you can take auditing of all the historic things which are happening, and then you can map it. And then you can also have landscape histories and other things which can be documented over time, like how things are changing. So you can have all those narratives which can be used for this. And then you also find ecosystem service approach also to be very useful, which can take care of all these dynamic static approach, and it can also take care of all these services which the nature provides. So ecosystem service approach can also be adopted, and you have already seen this in ecosystem services part where we did the EIA method. So those are the typologies which you have seen, and then some methods to capture different components of those typology. Then now we see another term, which is landscape value. So landscape value means the value that we attach to different landscape. So that's landscape value. And then there's another term, landscape quality. So this is said to be like how the condition of that landscape, the physical condition of that landscape, which might include that how much area is there, how much intact it is there, intact it is in terms of landscape, and how intact are the individual elements within that. So it will look at the landscape quality. Then you have another term, landscape quality. If you'll see that, it would also relate with the landscape value. So the better the quality, they might have more value to it. And then you have another term, which is visual amenity. So this is described as the how pleasant the entire environment is, how people enjoy it and cherish it, and how it attracts people, visually attracts people. So that's visual amenity. And then you also see that when you're dealing with landscape, and by now you have seen several other topics as well. So you would also feel or think that it is so much connected with the other subjects. So yes, this particular domain has a lot of interlinkages with the other domain. And whenever you will do EIA for this component, you might have to cross-reference with the other areas, like you might have to link with geology, you might have to link with terrestrial, aquatic, ecology, heritage, and all these dimensions you might have to cross-reference here. So that was about the concepts. Now looking at the scoping and baseline studies. So here, this is an important stage, like we have been saying. And in this stage, when you're dealing with landscape and visual assessment, in scoping, you determine to what extent you're going to do it, how far you're going to go, what kind of data you're going to collect. So here you identify like which area you're going to cover, for your landscape and visual assessments to identify the changes. So you have to demarcate, delineate the study area. Then you also need to identify different receptors or receptors who would be there. So you need to identify them. Further, you need to see how big is the intervention which you're going to do, and how big is the landscape or the context in which it is going to make impact. So you need to see those things, proportionality between the proposed project and the landscape you're talking about. And then, like we have been repeating it, like whenever you do the scoping stage, you look at only the significant effects. So if things which might not have significant effect, you might drop those theme areas. So there are, like, when you identify these study areas, there are certain terms which you need to take care of. That is zone of theoretical visibility, ZTV or ZTV, the way you might be pronouncing it. So ZTV, this is like the project area where you will undertake the study, where you will assess, and where the significant effect would happen. So that's called zone of theoretical visibility. And zone of theoretical visibility is used for the purpose of describing the what kind of area it is covering and what development will happen in that area. And then the best way to undertake this is to have it through digital terrain model, DTM, or you can also do digital surface model. So looking at the difference between the two, so you have digital terrain model is like, you have the differences that you have both are 3D computer models, but is like digital terrain model is just the profile of the land, how it is, whereas digital surface model will also include all the trees and heights and buildings which would be covering that terrain as well. So you can have both of it as per your requirement, DTM or DSM. And ZTV is also called as zone of visual influence also, or it's also called as visual envelope map as well. So you might come across these terms also. And how far this study area has to be. So this also varies depending on the nature of the project or the proportion of the project versus the landscape. So the range can be like from 10 kilometers to 30 kilometers or even beyond that. So that was about scoping. So now looking at the baseline part. So we'll see how we undertake the landscape baseline study. So the key idea about landscape baseline study is that you identify and look at, you assess how is the landscape in what study area you have decided to take and how the surrounding area is. And then you also need to identify all the individual elements which are of importance, and then look at the characteristic of it, like how the proportion is, and look at from the perspective of the local people. And then looking at what you should cover while you're doing the baseline study. So you look at the physical aspect, the geology and all those things, and then you also see how human activity influences it, and then what's the aesthetic part, how do you perceive it, and how all of these come together, and how is the historic landscape. So you have already seen different different factors which influence these things. So all those factors have to be seen when you are undertaking the baseline study. And you can undertake this baseline study through the desktop data collection, as well as when the field survey has to be also taken if required. So based on this, you would be taking baseline analysis, and you would be doing the analysis of the existing documents, maps. You would be looking at the current maps, you would be looking at the historic maps of the areas, and then maps of the landscape, and also all the other designated areas. So there are certain techniques to find out the study area. So you can use participative consultative technique. So you can have all those technique, you can walk along with the people and then try to find out what areas are important, what areas they take pride in. So you can ask people about what they use and what they perceive about a place, and you can document them. So further, how do we really evaluate the sensitivity of the landscape? So in order to check the sensitivity of the landscape, You see the how susceptible the landscape is there to the change, whatever change will happen, whether it will be able to adapt to those changes or not, and what kind of value the receptors give to that landscape. So that's about the landscape assessments. Now we're going to look at the visual baseline. So for the visual baseline, also you need to undertake depth studies, and then that would involve like ZTV and base maps have to be prepared, and if based on that you will be undertaking visual assessments. And then the key idea of taking visual baseline assessment is to identify and find out like what are the visual relationship between the site and the surrounding area. So how do they really work together? And you need to identify different viewpoints, and then you also need to identify key sensitive viewers who might be very protective about those places. So these spaces might include like representative viewpoint, where you have visual receptors, where you identify them. Then you can have specific viewpoint. Then you will also have illustrated viewpoint, where you might have restricted areas, but you might illustrate that how possible views could be. So you can look at certain examples here about various landscape. And then you can also have impacts which can affect the living conditions of the residents. There can be noise, there can be dust, changes in the daytime sunlight. So how the street lighting is there, what is the time of working, and how does that impact the landscape. So you can see in cases of wind turbines, then there can be shadow areas. So the impact can all be seen. You have to see all those impact in cumulative manner in EIA assessment. And now looking at the impact prediction and evaluation. So when we undertake impact prediction and evaluation, we really look at how effectively we are able to tell about what is really going to happen with the environment, like what is the nature of the change and what is the likelihood of change and what's the significance of the change. So it's very subjective, so it's going to be a really difficult part to handle. So what's really going to happen because of the kind of change which is going to happen here. So here you can see the how they are assessing the sensitivity of the different visual receptors. So here you can see the visual sensitive receptors, different receptors and different kind of changes, what type of receptors are there, and to what level that environment will change and what's their sensitivity towards their environment. So how do we really assess the landscape effects? So landscape impact assessment would like really through this you would like to tell what's the nature and the scale of change which is going to happen, and then because of those change what kind of impact it would happen on the character, and then the entire landscape character might change because of those effects. So that all you need to tell. And you need to also look at the characteristic of the project. And then you need to identify all the sensitive areas which might be affected because of your project. So whenever you check the significance of that, you generally tell what scale of change is happening. So whether there's a very common scale adopted is like whether you tell it's a large scale change, it's a medium scale change, it's a small scale change, or it's like there's no change. So you tell about that. So you can see the change, scale of change. So in this table you can see, and whether that's change is large or medium or small. So depending on that, you make your decision how much is to be acceptable or not. And this is another case where you see where you assess the landscape with all those aspects, the factors which you saw in terms of topographic feature, how much it is changing, the components, elements, how much they're changing, the drainage, hydrology, geology, and soil. So in the landscape, you're seeing everything in a cumulative manner. So the vegetation type cover, then archaeological history, how it's changing, the spatial quality of area, the infrastructure scale pattern, what's the magnitude, and then how's the impact of that. So here I have also given you a link to the landscape character assessment, the guidelines which is there, and then you can also look at the process they adopt. So in the process, you can see the how you define why you're doing the assessment, and then you look at the what's the scope of your assessment. You look at where all the emphasis would be and what kind of specialization, what kind of study area has to be taken, what level of detail has to be done. And then you would prepare the project brief, and then you would undertake, look at the methodology, you would undertake the desk study, then you will gather information, and then you will create all kind of baseline information on natural factors, social factors, cultural factors, and then you would do a detailed field study, and then you would undertake review, and then you would classify them, and then you would undertake final landscape character assessment. So this link I have given to you for this. And then now looking at visual assessments, how do you assess what kind of visual effects will happen, and then what do you really look at it when you do the visual impact assessment. So you look at the likely nature and scale of changes which will happen from the development, and then what will happen to the receptors of these elements. And here again, you might have to look at the sensitivity of the subject, and then the nature of change which is happening, and then you have to make an overall judgment. So if you have taken note, then you see that we have seen so far geology separately, water resource separately, but when you deal with this landscape, you're seeing everything in a very cumulative manner, everything together, and then making a judgment. So while looking at the magnitude of what kind of change will happen would depend on the scale and size of the change, and to what extent the change is happening. So when we look at the scale of change, we see that to what extent the change is happening, what kind of change is happening in terms of composition of the view, and what kind of loss or what kind of new elements are coming in, and then what kind of contrast we are creating in that particular place. So all those things, you look at it, and you can describe these changes in, again, large, medium, and small, and no change kind of thing. So here you see, again, the visual change, like that's the commonly used scale here. So is this a large scale, medium scale change, or a small scale change, or there is no change in the view which you're looking at. So you need to find out what kind of geographical extent this change is happening, and what's the sensitivity and magnitude of that when you're dealing with the visual changes also. So that will also again depend on the project magnitude. So here from one of the example, you can see how they are looking at the sensitivity, and then what kind of users, what kind of impact it would have, like motor, cyclist, or residents, and cyclists over there. So how sensitive they are, and then what impact it would have on there. So now looking at, there can be different ways how you can show the visual impact which is happening. So you might have to graphically show the visual effects for your project. So you can use photography, you can use photo montage, like which means overlapping the real scenario with the projected scenario. So you can have virtual reality and then form of visualization, which can be used to depict the landscape and the context which is there. So a photo montage, that means you show observer how the proposed development would look like. So you also have video montage where you can have like animated photo montages and you can show how it is happening. So these are also getting very popular, and these can really give a good understanding. So here you see how the photo montages, you can see on the upper that there's no change, and then with the new island how the changes are happening, and in the lower side you can see without project and then project how the landscape is going to change. So you see that here. And then you might also have to do assessment with cumulative and daylight and sunlight effect. So it's very difficult. You might see that landscape itself is a cumulative aspect, and then looking it through the time pattern, looking it through all the kind of projects which might come up. So that would add a lot of complexity to the process. So it's very complex, and it's still evolving process. So the complexity is because of like what future projects might come up, what because of the policy, what kind of change can happen, and which future project might get passed or not passed. So all those complexities are there. So it's said to be like a really complex project to assess the cumulative impact. So this was about the landscape and visual assessment. So summarizing what we covered today, we looked at the certain concepts. Then we identified items to be covered in scoping and baseline study. Then we looked at different impacts and methods and tools and techniques which are used in this domain. Then we do landscape effects, and we also understand the visual effects. So that was our coverage for today. So these were the references which we used for this part. So these are the suggested watch and read, and please feel free to ask questions. Let us know about any concerns you have. Do share your opinions, experiences, and suggestions. Looking forward to interacting and co-learning with you while exploring AIA. Thank you.